The Age of Revolutions, Part 1, The American Revolution. Revolutions in the Atlantic World and the Impact of Enlightenment Ideals. Lecture Terms. The Impact of the Enlightenment. This is Part 1 of a two-part lecture. Part 1, we're going to discuss the impact of the Enlightenment on the American Revolution as one of those Atlantic revolutions that begins in the late 18th century. We will discuss the impact of the Enlightenment on this revolution first, and then on the next lecture, when we discuss the French Revolution, we'll continue on in the same vein, discussing the impact of the Enlightenment on that revolution. To review, the Enlightenment philosophers had three basic areas of European society that they were targeting for ridicule, and they were desirous of reform in these areas. First of all, they criticized absolutism. Absolute government was against the natural rights of man, and they preferred instead government based on popular sovereignty. They also targeted and criticized organized religion. They were not necessarily atheist. Instead, they preferred deism, which they saw as a kind of natural religion. Organized religions, whether they be Christian or otherwise, they felt were too restrictive and promoted intolerance instead of promoting religious toleration. They also targeted what they saw as the inequality of the class system in the majority of Western society. They did not understand why society would value one human being who was born with the same natural rights as another, why they would prefer one over the other based upon what family they were born into. Instead, they preferred equality before the law. Popular sovereignty was what the philosophers desired to take place in most of the governments all over Western Europe. The philosophers, if you recall, were folks who believed that by the basic nature of man, goodness could be promoted. They believed ultimately that man, at his very nature, was basically good and was capable of looking out for his own best interests. They also extrapolated from the scientific revolution's ideas about natural laws governing the universe. They felt that if there were natural laws that governed the universe, perhaps there were some kind of natural components that govern society. And this eventually led to the notion of the natural rights of man. This, remember, came from John Locke, 1632 to 1704, and he wrote two treatises on government. Now, these ideas were based upon reason. Ultimately, what Locke was discussing was that government that was absolute ultimately impinged upon the natural rights of man, which he saw as life, liberty, and property. We discussed those in the last lecture. If that is true, he argued that instead of power in a state being absolute, ultimately that power in any state comes from the people. That's what sovereignty is. Power is sovereignty. So popular sovereignty means that the people have the power. To review, he said the people ultimately make up the state, and therefore the power is in their hands. In exchange for protection of their natural rights, through law and order. They give up a portion of that power to a monarch who in turn, through a social contract, guarantees the protection of those natural rights. The monarch gets the power from the people, and he engages in a contract with them, guaranteeing their natural rights through the laws that he will create. Locke, remember, also stated the sole purpose of government was to protect the natural rights of man, life, liberty, and property. And so if a monarch overstepped those bounds, the people had the right to rebel because he had gone against the contract and he was ruling without their consent. The basis of power should be popular sovereignty, and this ultimately will become the basis for many kinds of constitutional governments that will be created through the 18th and 19th centuries. Religious toleration was yet another ideal that the Enlightenment philosophes promoted. Voltaire is a perfect philosopher to observe, to look at the notion of religious toleration. First of all, he was a noted deist, believing in a kind of natural religion, not atheistic, but indeed anti-clerical. He believed that organized religion promoted intolerance instead of toleration. And ultimately, he will criticize a great deal organized religions that hunt down others and claim that their way is the only way to believe, and others who believe differently are worthy of death. Since he was from France, he oftentimes got in trouble with the Roman Catholic Church, since France remained a Catholic country. But through his writings, he promoted toleration as well as understanding and compassion. Voltaire was one of the most noted philosophers because he was very well written. The targeted audience of most of the philosophers was the reading public. Since the printing press had been invented a few centuries prior to Voltaire's life, he was able to utilize that printing press to his advantage. And ultimately, the reading public, which was increasingly the upper middle class, were his audience, and he was trying to convince them to come over to his way of thinking about a number of things. One of his most noted books is Candide. In Candide, he uses satire to poke fun at the ills of European society. He pokes fun at absolute monarchy. He pokes fun at the class system that was based on birthright instead of by merit or equality. But in particular, he really ridicules the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, which of course was one of the organized religions the philosophers were targeting. He was very much a promoter of understanding, and he defended heretics on many occasions. He also spent a great deal of time in prison for his views. Equality before the law was yet another ideal that the philosophers adhered to. Again, another prominent philosopher that represents this idea greatly is Rousseau. He lived from 1712 to 1778. Now, Rousseau was a great believer in the age of reason, as all the philosophers were, but he did understand the importance of emotion as well. He did not think that it was good to abandon emotion entirely in exchange for reason. Instead, he said that reason should be tempered with emotion, because if you abandon emotion completely, you abandon a huge portion of the human experience. You cannot experience love, friendship, and such things without emotions. Now, having said that, he did understand the importance also of equality before the law, based on the principles that man, by his basic nature, was good and could look out for his own best interests. He wrote a book called Social Contract, borrowing that phrase from Locke, who had discussed the social contract theory of governing, limiting the power of the king, balancing it with the power of the people. And he borrowed that phrase and titled his book with that phrase, Social Contract. In this book, he discusses what he calls the general will. This is what he says is the general will of the majority of society. And he argues that the general will of the people can never be wrong. The general will of the people should always be at the heart of any government. In many cases, this means majority rule, as I said. And in some cases, we will see there are some drawbacks to majority rule. Oftentimes, there is a minority opinion that should be listened to, and perhaps compromises should be made. It's not as black and white as many of the philosophes would have hoped. But these three issues, popular sovereignty, religious toleration, and equality before the law, were things that the philosophes wanted to be the center of any government and any society. Society should not value the opinion of a wealthy nobleman any more than a landless peasant. The American Revolution. The impact of the Enlightenment and the disenchantment with increased British control in North America. We're going to delve into this revolution and discuss how the ideals of the Enlightenment that we just discussed had a great influence on this revolution. The British colonies in North America. Up until the late 1700s, the British government back at home in England allowed the colonists in North America to pretty much govern themselves. Yes, they had a royal representative, a royal governor, that would oversee the colony, but the general day-to-day governing and the raising of taxes to pay for certain projects, etc., was handled locally for the most part. And this went on from the 1600s until the late 1700s. And so for quite a long time, for over 100 years, the British colonists, although they were still British citizens, were able to govern themselves. And this would continue until there were two wars that occurred that will cause a shift in the British policy in North America. The French and Indian War, which begins in 1754 and continues to 1763, is a war fought between Great Britain and France, France allying with the Native American Indians, and that will be fought on the continent of North America. But the 7 Years' War, which begins in 1756 and continues to 1763, is basically the same war. The war begins on the North American continent between these two nations and their colonies, and it will eventually spill over and spread into the continent itself. Ultimately, this showdown led to the British colonists, of course, fighting side by side with the British soldiers that were sent over across the ocean from the homeland back in Britain. They would fight side by side against the French and the Indians. Back in Europe, of course, the British and the French fought outright on the continent. Great Britain ultimately wins this war, or these wars. They're technically the same war on two continents. And that will lead to a great deal of clout or power given to Great Britain on the international stage. Land equals power, which also means land equals political clout on the world stage. Whenever one wins a war, the balance of power shifts in their favor. Ultimately, when you win a war, you usually are ceded territory. So if land equals power, a victory in a war increases the victor's power, and it decreases the defeated's power. And so this was a great victory for Great Britain, but it was still very costly. Wars cost money. And so after the 1760s, the British decided to tighten their control on their colonies in North America. They were trying to recover the costs of those previous wars against France by initiating some new taxes. Now, a lot of taxes were also increased on the British citizens at home in England, but throughout the empire, they will launch new taxes to help recoup from the losses, the economic losses of the wars. Ultimately, this meant that new taxes were levied on the British colonists in North America. They were known as acts. And many of these new acts did not please the British colonists in North America. The Sugar Act, the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts are all new taxes that were being levied specifically on the British colonists in North America. And this angered them because even though they were British citizens and they understood that as British citizens they were required to pay taxes like British citizens did, but these taxes that were being levied in the colonies were specifically on the British citizens living in those colonies, not those living at home in England. And these new taxes were passed by Parliament and the King specifically for these colonists. Now, the colonists did not have representatives in Parliament back at home in England. And so when Parliament, which is supposed to be the representative body of the people, passes these new acts, these new taxes, levying them on specifically the British subjects in North America, they cry that they are being taxed without really being able to vote on whether those taxes should be passed, because they don't have a representative in Parliament. Ultimately, this led to a great many of those American colonists to fight back. They declared no taxation without representation. Based on traditions passed with the English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution, they believed that they should not be taxed without them having a say in creating those new taxes. Since they didn't have a representative in Parliament, they were not allowed to vote on those new taxes. Resistance in the colonies was sometimes violent. So the British eventually sent troops to the colonies to, quote, keep the peace. Sometimes these scuffles ended up in deaths. In 1775, shots were fired at Lexington. And that ultimately will be the shot heard around the world, and the American Revolution begins. Now, even though technically the revolution began after the shots fired at Lexington in 1775, it will not be until the next year, in 1776, that finally the written, quote, justification for the rebellion that encapsulates a great number of the Enlightenment ideals of the philosophes about popular sovereignty being the basis of a government is articulated. The Declaration of Independence, which was technically written by Thomas Jefferson for the Continental Congress, will be signed on July 4th, 1776. In this document, he uses a great deal of Locke's justifications for why subjects have the right to rebel against an absolute monarch. He declares that the colonists have unalienable rights. Those he outlined as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is very much in the same line of what Locke had said, with the natural rights of man being life, liberty, and property. He also used a lot of the phrases directly from two treatises on government. All men are created equal, enshrined with natural rights, or unalienable rights, as he puts it. And the colonists, through this document, were outlining that they had the, quote, right to rebel because as the king was levying these new taxes on them with the Parliament, without their consent, without them having a representative in Parliament, he was governing without their consent. If the basis of a government under a monarch was for that monarch to maintain the protection of everyone's natural rights, if he was going against that by ruling without their consent, then they had the right to rebel. Locke's ideas are extremely prevalent all throughout this document. And it's interesting that this document is written after the rebellion already begins as a justification for what they had already done. What we do need to note is that there were citizens throughout the colonies in the years prior to this, since the end of the French and Indian War, who had been calling for rebellion to declare themselves independent. One such individual was Thomas Paine. You are reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense this week, and you will use that book as one of your sources on your paper at the end of the semester. Now, Thomas Paine, ultimately in Common Sense, also encapsulates a lot of the ideals of Locke. In this book, he's basically arguing to try to convince other colonists why they should rebel. He outlines what he sees as the abuses of the king, and he outlines that the natural rights of man are being infringed upon. He wrote this document in very clear terms, not necessarily in hoity-toity kind of language. He wrote it in a language that was easier for the common man, the common reading man, that is, that he could understand. And ultimately, Thomas Paine's Common Sense becomes convinced a great number of people as it spread throughout the colonies that they were right to rebel against the king. So once the revolution begins with the shots at Lexington, later on the Continental Congress wants to create an official document outlining why they rebelled. Thomas Paine and John Locke their writings are both extremely influential on this document. Now, needless to say, this was a huge undertaking by the colonists, and it wasn't as if every single person living in North America who had been a British subject was in support of this revolution. A great number of them recognized that by rebelling, they would be committing treason. All of those members who had signed the Declaration of Independence knew that by signing this, they were committing treason against their government, the British Crown, and they could be subject to hanging as a result of that. Also, the colonists would be greatly outnumbered either way. If every single colonist supported the revolution, which they didn't, they would still be greatly outnumbered by the British soldiers who were sent over. The British costs for the war were also extensive, though. And remember, the British were still trying to recoup from the costs of the previous wars they had had against France. So the colonists were able to, I guess you would say, use that to their advantage, because Great Britain was already suffering economically from the previous wars. Not only that, the British soldiers were fighting a war across an ocean from their homeland, which meant it was difficult sometimes to get supplies to resupply those troops, especially when the colonists started to blockade the coastline and keep the British from receiving those supplies. Another thing that made the colonists be able to come out on top, or gave them an advantage at least, were the fact that the colonists were fighting on their own terrain, on their own turf. Ultimately, they could use this to their advantage. They had knowledge of the land. They knew where they could hide. They knew where they could ambush the British troops. And guerrilla tactics were often very effective. The guerrilla tactics ultimately allowed them to be more successful against themselves being greatly outnumbered by the British soldiers. Even with all that, it would be very important, imperative, if you will, that the Americans have effective leadership if they were going to pull this off. And that they had in George Washington. He lived from 1732 to 1799, and George Washington really proved himself as a worthy leader in this war. Ultimately, through his effective leadership, through the use of guerrilla tactics, and through a little luck, the British colonists, who now refer to themselves as Americans, were able to defeat the British. They also gained the support from France, Spain, the Netherlands, and some German principalities. These were all British rivals in Europe that ultimately found it prudent to support the Americans in their rebellion, primarily to smite Britain. France, in particular, was a big supplier or bankroller of the American cause. Now, back in France, they did have an absolute monarch. At this time, it was Louis XVI. And it seems ironic that a government run by an absolute monarch would aid these rebels who are fighting against their own monarch. Louis XVI could care less about the ideals of the American revolutionaries. He could care less that they were using the justification for their rebellion of the Enlightenment ideals of popular sovereignty and equality before the law. All he really wanted to do was to smite England, who had just defeated him in those previous wars, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. To hurt England ultimately would be to bolster France, and he also hoped that perhaps By helping the Americans, he could gain back some of the territories that he had lost to England in North America. America, a new nation. After the war was over, the real hard work began. America now had to create a new government for themselves, and they had to start from scratch. Ultimately, they will go through a couple of different trial runs, if you will, before they come up with something that really works. The initial knee-jerk reaction of the Americans was to create a very loose central government, did not have a lot of power, and most of the power was in the states. The colonies became states. The problem was, without a strong central government, it was difficult to pay taxes, to raise the money needed to pay the debts that they had incurred in the war to those countries that helped to bankroll them. Instead, it was a confederation, if you will, of independent states themselves, with the Articles of Confederation. They quickly realized that they needed a stronger central government in order to take care of those kinds of things. They were worried about tyranny, but they finally settled on what will be the basic principles of limiting the power of the central government and balancing it with the power of the people. Ultimately, this will culminate in the Constitution of the United States being written in 1787. In this document, you see the Enlightenment ideals in action. First of all, the rights of individuals were guaranteed. The right to religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc. Although full rights were only given to men of property. That is important to note. At this particular time, they were not talking about rights for all people equally, even though equality before the law was something that they enshrined as a justification for their rebellion in the first place. We will not yet have universal equality. That will come over time. The other thing that the Constitution enshrined was popular sovereignty as the basis for choosing representatives in this new republic that is created. Each of the states would choose representatives to represent them in the central government. And over time, this will evolve into a number of branches of the government being created. There will be a president that will reside over all, that would be elected. There would also be a legislature, which will eventually have two houses to it, a Senate and a House of Representatives, and of course also eventually a judicial branch with the Supreme Court. Each of these branches of government was to check and balance the other's power. This takes a page directly from Montesquieu in what he wrote about in his Spirit of Laws that we discussed in the last lecture. Balance of power among the different branches of government, checks and balances, separation of powers. The disenfranchised groups, however, that still remain, will fight for these same rights over the next 2 centuries. Women, slaves that will be freed, and others. Over time, we will see the fight for these same rights that were enshrined in the Constitution for propertied men. They will eventually be granted to all of those groups in American society. The experiment with Enlightenment ideals being the basis, the foundation of a new government, limiting the power of the central government with the power of the people. Ultimately, this experiment worked, but it took time. It was an evolutionary process to build this government. A revolution began the process, but it will be an evolutionary process working towards this new kind of government. It does not happen overnight. Thank you.